Oscar Harrison was used to having the world at his feet. At just 35, he wasn't merely a millionaire, he was the millionaire. His life was a symphony of success, a flourishing career, an immense fortune, and a fiancée who looked like she had stepped out of a fashion magazine. Elsie Scott, the bride, wasn't just stunning, she was the perfect partner for Oscar's seemingly flawless life. Together, they were the kind of couple that dreams were made of. Today was their big day, the wedding that all of New York society had been eagerly awaiting. It was a spectacle meant to dazzle, a grand celebration with exotic imported flowers, a venue fit for royalty, and a guest list brimming with the city's elite. For Oscar, it was yet another event where he would command the spotlight, something he had grown quite accustomed to. But as he adjusted his tie in the mirror, an unfamiliar unease gnawed at him. Over the past few days, his phone had been buzzing incessantly with calls from his lawyers, which he had repeatedly brushed aside. Business could wait. Nothing was more important than this day, his day. Yet, as he stared at his reflection, something felt off. Perhaps it was the weight of the moment, or perhaps it was the persistent buzzing of his phone that refused to let him fully escape into the celebration. Outside, the world was still perfect. Guests were arriving, cameras flashed, and laughter filled the air. But inside, as Oscar prepared to head down to the altar, his phone buzzed again, this time more insistently. Against his better judgment, he picked it up. The name of his lead lawyer, Theo, flashed on the screen. Oscar hesitated, tempted to ignore it once more, but something compelled him to answer. "We need to talk," Theo said, his voice heavy with urgency. "Not now," Oscar snapped. "I'm about to get married. This can wait." "No, it can't," Theo insisted. There was a long pause, then he said, "The deal with CNC Corporation has fallen apart." Oscar frowned, not fully grasping the gravity of the statement. "What do you mean?" "The investment. The funds. We've lost everything." The words struck Oscar like a thunderclap. His palms grew sweaty, and the phone nearly slipped from his hand. "Lost everything?" he whispered, his voice trembling. CNC had gone bankrupt, Theo explained, and with it, all of Oscar's investments. The fortune he had painstakingly built, the empire that had defined his life, had evaporated in a single devastating blow. "I don't understand," Oscar murmured. "How could this happen? My empire, it's solid." "It's gone," Theo interrupted. "We need to meet immediately to discuss the next steps. I'm on my way to the venue." The line went dead. Oscar stood motionless, staring at his reflection. The man in the mirror was no longer the confident titan of industry he had always been. Instead, he saw a man lost, his future crumbling beneath him. The door burst open and Harry, his best friend, walked in with a wide grin. "Ready to conquer the world again, champ?" Oscar forced a smile, but inside, his world was unraveling. How could he face Harry? How could he face Elsie? Would she still want him now that his fortune was gone? He glanced toward the hall, where guests were settling into their seats, oblivious to the storm brewing behind the scenes. Everything he had ever valued, his wealth, his reputation, his power, had vanished in an instant. His heart raced as he considered his options. Should he confess the truth now, before the ceremony? Or should he carry on, pretending everything was fine, at least for today? The weight of the moment pressed down on him, and for the first time in his life, Oscar Harrison didn't know what to do. He turned back to Harry, his voice caught in his throat. The truth was inevitable. He had to be honest, with Harry, with Elsie, and with himself. Oscar Harrison stood frozen, the reality of his crumbled life pressing down on him. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, trapped by the fear of public humiliation and the crushing knowledge that everything he had built was gone. The door separating him from Elsie loomed ahead, and he felt the unbearable weight of the steps he needed to take. Behind that door, the woman he had believed would be by his side forever was likely making the final adjustments to her flawless wedding gown, unaware of the chaos about to unfold. Just as he reached for the door, it swung open abruptly. Florence, one of Elsie's bridesmaids and closest friends, entered, her eyes wide with urgency. "Oscar, we need to talk," she said quickly, her voice trembling. His heart sank even further. "What is it?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. She's heard rumors, Florence said. Elsie knows something's wrong. She wants the truth. Now, Oscar felt his world spin faster. How had the news spread before he even had the chance to tell her himself? His options were dwindling. He could lie to save the moment or tell the truth and risk everything unraveling. There was no hiding now. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's in the preparation room," Florence said, her worry evident. "You need to talk to her before this gets worse." Each step Oscar took toward Elsie felt heavier than the last. When he reached the door, he paused, bracing himself for what was to come, and then entered. Elsie stood facing a mirror, adjusting her veil with the precision of someone who believed this was the happiest day of her life. Her reflection was serene and radiant, but Oscar's heart clenched at the thought of shattering that image. When she heard the door close, Elsie turned to him, her expression shifting from curiosity to suspicion. The room felt suffocatingly silent. "Oscar," she said, her voice calm but heavy with tension, "what's going on?" He struggled to speak. How could he explain the devastation of the last few hours? How could he tell her that the future he had promised her no longer existed? "I've lost everything," he finally admitted, his voice breaking. "The business collapsed. I'm bankrupt." The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Elsie's eyes widened, and she froze as if the news had physically struck her. "What?" she whispered, her voice quivering. "What do you mean, bankrupt? How could this happen?" "It was the CNC Corporation," he tried to explain. "They went under, and everything I had, was tied to them. I didn't see it coming." Elsie took a step back, her expression shifting from shock to anger. "You lost everything?" she repeated, disbelief dripping from every word. "How could you let this happen? How could you bring me here, knowing you were bankrupt? You lied to me, Oscar. To all of us." He stepped toward her, his hand outstretched, but she retreated further, fury blazing in her eyes. "What do you expect me to do now?" she demanded. "Stand by you while you start over from nothing? Live a life without luxury, without any of the promises you made to me? That's not what I signed up for, Oscar." Her words pierced deeper than any financial loss. He saw now that the bond between them was not built on love but on the lifestyle he had offered. Before he could respond, Elsie turned sharply, tearing off her bouquet and throwing it to the floor in a fit of rage. "I can't do this," she said, her voice firm and resolute. "I can't marry someone who has nothing." She stormed out of the room, her voice echoing loudly enough for the guests to hear. Whispers erupted as Elsie tore off her veil and threw it to the ground before disappearing through the venue doors. Oscar remained standing, frozen in disbelief and despair. He could hear the rising murmurs of the crowd outside, their excitement shifting into gossip and judgment. What had been poised to be the grandest wedding of the year had turned into a public spectacle of humiliation. He glanced around the room, now feeling cold and empty, the weight of failure pressing down on him. It wasn't just his fortune that he had lost, it was his reputation, his pride, and the woman he had thought would stand by him no matter what. For the first time in his life, Oscar Harrison felt utterly alone. Oscar Harrison sat on the small wooden porch of his rented countryside house, staring at the vast expanse of green fields stretching out before him. The stillness of the landscape was foreign, almost unsettling. For a man who had thrived amidst the ceaseless buzz of New York, the silence now felt like both a punishment and an opportunity. He had lost everything: his fortune, his status, and the woman he thought he loved. Yet here he was, far from the chaos, trying to piece himself back together. The memory of the wedding still haunted him. The way Elsie's voice had risen with anger, her disdainful words cutting through him like shards of glass. The guests' murmurs, the judgment in their eyes, and the feeling of utter defeat as she walked away had played on repeat in his mind. Leaving the city had been the only choice. He couldn't face the people who once looked up to him, not like this. His best friend Harry had been his anchor. Harry, who had witnessed his lowest moment and refused to abandon him. "We'll figure it out," Harry had said with unwavering determination. Those words had stayed with Oscar, giving him a glimmer of hope when everything else felt hopeless. The small house was nothing like the luxury penthouse he had called home. There were no marble floors, no grand views of the city skyline, just creaky wooden boards and a single window looking out at the fields. The kitchen was basic, the furniture mismatched, and the amenities scarce. Yet, in the simplicity of it all, there was a strange comfort. For the first time in years, Oscar was forced to slow down and confront himself, stripped of all the trappings of wealth. The townspeople were kind but curious. They didn't know his story, only that a stranger had moved into the little house at the edge of town. Oscar preferred it that way. He avoided their questions, their lingering looks, and instead focused on the small, mundane tasks that now filled his days, fixing a loose floorboard, repairing a broken chair, cooking simple meals. These small victories felt foreign yet grounding. Harry called often, checking in and encouraging him to take things one step at a time. "This isn't the end, Oscar," he would say. "You've got the brains, the drive. You just need a fresh start." But a fresh start seemed impossible. The weight of his past clung to him, a constant reminder of the man he used to be, the man who had everything and lost it all. He often sat outside late into the night, the stars above him a stark contrast to the blinding city lights he once adored. The quiet forced him to think, to reflect on what truly mattered and what had led him to this point. As the weeks passed, Oscar began to notice small changes in himself. The anger and self-pity that had consumed him after the wedding began to fade. He started visiting the local library, poring over books on business and finance, not for the grand schemes of his past but to learn from his mistakes. He helped an elderly neighbor repair a fence, finding unexpected satisfaction in the physical work. Slowly, he began to see life differently, not as a series of achievements to display but as moments to be lived. One evening, while sitting on the porch with a notebook in hand, he began sketching out ideas for a small venture. Nothing grandiose, just something simple and sustainable. For the first time in months, he felt a spark of excitement, a sense of purpose returning to him. Harry's voice echoed in his mind, "You'll come through this." Oscar didn't know where the path ahead would lead, but for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to take the first step. The city and its glamour were behind him, but perhaps this quiet little town held the promise of something greater, a chance to rebuild not just his life but himself. Oscar Harrison wiped down the last table, the hum of the restaurant's kitchen now quiet, the air carrying the faint aroma of grilled food and cleaning supplies. The simple rhythms of his new life had begun to settle into place, though they still felt foreign. Each day was both a distraction and a reckoning, a break from his spiraling thoughts but also a constant reminder of how far he had fallen. He worked hard, but the tasks were humbling, cleaning tables, taking orders, scrubbing pots. For a man who once commanded boardrooms and signed deals worth millions, the adjustment had been anything but easy. Yet, there was an odd sense of solace in the monotony, a relief in being just another man, unnoticed and unburdened by expectations. The turning point, however, came in the form of Sarah, a waitress at the restaurant. From the moment they met, Oscar had been intrigued by her grounded nature. Sarah was everything his former life had not been: practical, genuine, and utterly unimpressed by him. While others might have been drawn to his former power or charm, Sarah treated him as she did everyone else, with fairness and honesty. For Oscar, this was unsettling at first. He wasn't used to being treated so plainly. But as time passed, he realized he craved her authenticity. Sarah didn't carry the airs or pretenses that had surrounded him for so long. In her, Oscar found a mirror, not to the man he used to be, but to the man he might become. One evening, after a particularly quiet shift, the two were cleaning up the restaurant. The steady rhythm of their work filled the air until Oscar broke the silence, his voice soft but tinged with vulnerability. "Have you ever thought about what you'd do if everything went wrong?" he asked, almost to himself. Sarah paused mid-swipe and looked at him, curious but not intrusive. "What do you mean?" If you lost everything. If your life just fell apart overnight," Oscar clarified, his gaze fixed on a stubborn spot on the table. Sarah leaned against the counter, her expression thoughtful. "I think I've been there before," she said simply, her tone devoid of pity or bitterness. "And I guess, here I am. Sometimes losing everything helps you figure out what really matters." Oscar felt her words land heavily, cutting through the fog of his self-pity. It was the first time someone had articulated what he was too afraid to admit. "I had everything once," he confessed, still unable to meet her eyes. "And I lost it all. I don't even know where to start." Sarah studied him for a moment before speaking, her voice calm but firm. "Maybe you're spending too much time thinking about what you've lost, instead of what you can build from here." Her words struck a chord deep within him, resonating in a way he hadn't expected. For so long, Oscar had been fixated on what was gone: his fortune, his status, his fiancée. He had seen himself as a man defined by what he no longer had. But Sarah's perspective was different, and it gave him pause. Over the following weeks, Oscar began to see his new life in a different light. The work that once felt beneath him now felt grounding. He learned the names of the regular customers, laughed at Frank's bad jokes, and found satisfaction in finishing small tasks well. The simplicity of his days gave him something he hadn't realized he needed: clarity. And then there was Sarah. She wasn't just kind, she was quietly resilient, carrying herself with a strength that inspired Oscar. Her laughter was infectious, her ability to find joy in the mundane surprising. He couldn't pinpoint when his feelings for her began to shift, but he started looking forward to their moments together, whether it was cleaning tables side by side or sharing a quick joke during the dinner rush. One crisp Friday night, after Frank had decided to close the restaurant early, Oscar and Sarah stayed behind to tidy up. The silence between them was comfortable, filled only with the occasional clatter of plates and the soft swish of the mop. "So, Oscar," Sarah began, breaking the stillness, "what are you going to do now?" The question caught him off guard. He set the cloth he was holding aside and met her gaze. For the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't try to put up a front. "I don't know," he admitted. "I guess I'm still figuring out who I am without all of that." Sarah smiled gently, her expression neither pitying nor patronizing. "Maybe that's the point," she said. "Figuring it out, day by day. You don't have to have all the answers right now." Her words settled over him like a bomb. For so long, he had believed that rebuilding meant reclaiming everything he had lost. But maybe Sarah was right. Maybe it was about redefining what mattered, finding value not in possessions or prestige but in purpose and connection. As they locked up the restaurant that night and stepped into the cool air, Oscar felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. It was fragile and tentative, but it was there. Maybe he didn't have a clear plan, and maybe the road ahead was uncertain. But for the first time, he felt like he had a chance to rebuild, not just his life, but himself. And maybe, just maybe, Sarah would be part of that journey. Oscar stared at Theo, his expression unreadable as the offer hung in the air. The words, "recover your fortune," struck a chord, one that both tempted and unsettled him. For so long he had defined himself by his wealth, his ability to command respect and admiration through his success. Now, after losing everything, part of him wondered if this was the chance he had been waiting for, to rebuild, to reclaim his old life. But as he glanced across the restaurant, his eyes fell on Sarah. She was smiling as she handed plates to a table of locals, her movements unhurried, her demeanor genuine. The simplicity of her life, the peace she carried, it had started to seep into him in ways he hadn't anticipated. What if the life he thought he needed to reclaim wasn't the life he truly wanted anymore? "What's the catch?" Oscar asked, his tone cautious. He knew Theo well enough to suspect there was more to the proposal than he was letting on. "No catch," Theo replied smoothly, leaning back in his chair. "It's a clean slate. I've got investors lined up, ready to back us. With your expertise and connections, we can make it work." Oscar shook his head, a bitter smile forming. "Connections? Expertise? Theo, the last time I trusted you, I lost everything. Why would this time be different?" Theo leaned forward, his tone softening. "Because this time, you know what's at stake. And because deep down, you're not made for this." He gestured around the restaurant dismissively. "You belong in the big leagues, Oscar. You don't want to spend the rest of your life wiping down tables, do you?" The comment stung, but Oscar held his ground. "This," he said, gesturing around the restaurant, "might not be glamorous, but it's honest. And for the first time in years, I don't feel like I'm suffocating under expectations." Theo frowned, clearly frustrated. Look, I'm not here to argue. Think about it, okay? Call me when you're ready to stop hiding and start living again. With that, Theo stood, leaving a business card on the table before walking out. That evening, Oscar found himself sitting in the small house he now called home, staring at Theo's card. The words swirled in his mind. You're not made for this. Wiping down tables? Hiding, they clashed with everything he had begun to understand about himself in the past few weeks. Could he really walk away from the life he was starting to rebuild? Or was Theo right? Was he just running from the reality of who he was? As he turned the card over in his hands, there was a knock at the door. Sarah stood there, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern. You seemed distracted today, she said, stepping inside when he invited her in. What's going on? Oscar hesitated, then handed her Theo's card. An old business partner. He wants me to get back into the game. Sarah studied the card for a moment before looking at him. And I don't know, Oscar admitted. Part of me feels like I should jump at the chance. But another part of me. He trailed off, struggling to articulate the conflict raging inside him. Another part of you wonders if it's worth it, Sarah finished for him. If going back to that life will actually make you happy? Oscar nodded, surprised at how easily she understood. I don't know what I'm supposed to do, Sarah. That life, it's all I've ever known. But since I've been here, I've started to think that maybe there's another way. Sarah smiled gently. The question isn't what you're supposed to do, Oscar. It's what you want to do. Do you really want that life back? Or are you ready to find something new, something real? Her words struck him deeply, as they always seemed to. He looked at her, realizing how much she had come to mean to him. Sarah represented everything his old life had lacked: honesty, resilience, and a grounded sense of purpose. I don't know if I can, Oscar said quietly. Walk away from all of it, I mean. You already have, Sarah replied simply. The question is whether you'll let yourself keep walking. The next day, Theo called, eager for a response. Oscar let the phone ring. He wasn't ready to answer, not Theo's call, and not the question of whether to reclaim his old life or continue forging a new one. But for the first time, he felt like he was getting closer to an answer. The simple act of not picking up the phone felt like a small victory. As Oscar walked to the restaurant that morning, he thought about Sarah's words, her quiet strength, and the way she had built her life on her own terms. He didn't know what the future held, but he was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, he didn't need to rebuild what he had lost. Maybe it was enough to build something entirely new. Oscar met Sarah's gaze, his voice steady as he continued. Losing it all wasn't just an end, it was a beginning. For the first time, I'm learning to live for something more than appearances or power. I don't want to go back to that version of myself. Sarah's expression softened, her arms uncrossing as she took in his words. That's a big decision, she said gently. It takes courage to walk away from something so familiar, especially when it promises everything you thought you wanted. Oscar nodded. It does. But what I want now isn't what I used to chase. Working here, being around you, it's made me see things differently. I'm starting to understand that success isn't about what I own but about who I am and the life I build. A faint smile touched Sarah's lips. You've changed, Oscar, she said. When you first came here, I don't think you would have said any of that. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. Neither would I. But meeting you, seeing how you live with honesty and purpose, it's made me want something different. Something real. There was a pause, and Oscar felt his chest tighten. He had never been one for vulnerability, but this felt like a moment he couldn't let slip away. Sarah, he began, his voice quieter now. You've been the reason I've started to see the world differently. I don't know where this path leads, but I know that I don't want to walk it without you. Sarah's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, she seemed caught off guard. But then she smiled, genuine and warm, the kind of smile that had drawn him in from the start. I'm glad you said that, she admitted, because I think I've been feeling the same way. You're not the only one who's changed, Oscar. Seeing you grow, watching you rediscover who you are, it's reminded me why I left my old life behind. You make me believe in second chances. Oscar felt a wave of relief and happiness wash over him, the likes of which he hadn't felt in years. Then maybe we can figure out this new life together, he said, hope threading through his voice. Sarah nodded. Maybe we can. The following weeks brought a sense of renewal to Oscar's life. He approached his days at the restaurant with a newfound lightness, no longer seeing the work as a step down but as a foundation for something meaningful. His connection with Sarah deepened as they spent more time together, their bond rooted in shared understanding and mutual respect. One evening, as they closed up the restaurant, Sarah turned to him and asked, "Do you ever think about the future? What you want it to look like?" Oscar thought for a moment before answering. "I think I want it to look like this," he said, gesturing around the quiet restaurant, "but with one difference." "What's that?" Sarah asked, curious. He took her hand, meeting her gaze. "You by my side." Sarah's smile in response was all the affirmation he needed. For the first time in his life, Oscar felt free, not because he had regained wealth or status, but because he had chosen a life that was truly his own. One defined by simplicity, authenticity, and the chance to build something lasting with someone who saw him for who he truly was. Theo's words echoed in Oscar's mind long after he had left the table. Asterisk, this isn't small. I'm talking about getting you back to the top. Asterisk for a moment, the old Oscar, the ambitious, ruthless businessman, stirred within him. The thrill of power, the allure of status, and the promise of reclaiming his place in the world tempted him like a siren's call. But then his eyes drifted around the small restaurant. The worn wooden tables, the hum of quiet conversations, and the comforting aroma of freshly cooked meals painted a picture of simplicity he had grown to cherish. Across the room, Sarah moved gracefully, chatting with customers and laughing lightly at their jokes. Her presence grounded him, and in that moment, he knew the weight of the decision he faced. Theo leaned in, his voice confident. "I won't sugarcoat it, Oscar. I know it's been tough, but you're not meant for this small-town life. You're a businessman, a shark. You can get it all back. The wealth, the respect, the power. So, what's it going to be?" Oscar met Theo's expectant gaze. It wasn't just about the money or the success. It was about who he had been and who he was trying to become. He could feel the pull of his old life, but it came with a cost. A return to a world that had stripped him of his identity and left him hollow inside. "I don't know if I want to be that man again," Oscar said finally, his voice firm but measured. Theo blinked, startled. "Are you serious? This is your shot, Oscar. You're throwing it all away for, what? Cleaning tables? This isn't you." Oscar smiled faintly, a bittersweet expression. "Maybe it's not who I was, but it's who I'm becoming. For the first time in years, Theo, I feel like I'm truly living, not chasing." Theo scoffed, shaking his head. "You're making a mistake. You're throwing your life away." Oscar stood, his movements deliberate. "No, Theo. For the first time, I'm doing what's right for me." He walked away, leaving Theo at the table, his shoulders lighter than they had felt in years. As he neared the door, he glanced at Sarah. She caught his eye and smiled, a simple, knowing smile that felt like a promise. In that moment, Oscar knew he had made the right choice. Later that evening, the restaurant was quiet as Sarah finished cleaning. When Oscar walked in, her brow arched in playful curiosity. "Back again? Should I set a table for you?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "Not this time. I came to talk." Intrigued, Sarah leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. "What's on your mind?" Oscar hesitated, searching for the right words. But as he looked into her steady, kind eyes, he realized he didn't need a rehearsed speech. "Theo came to see me today," he began. "He offered me a chance to get it all back. The money, the status, everything." Sarah's expression shifted subtly, her curiosity sharpening. "And? I turned him down," Oscar said simply, his voice steady. She blinked, surprised. "Why?" Oscar took a deep breath. "Because it's not who I am anymore. I thought money defined me, that without it I was nothing. But losing it all taught me something. I was wrong. What I've found here, what I'm finding in myself, it's worth so much more." For a moment, Sarah said nothing, studying him carefully. Then she smiled, a warm, genuine expression that reached her eyes. "You've come a long way, Oscar, she said softly. I'm proud of you. Her words hit him harder than he expected, filling a void he hadn't realized was there. It's because of you, Sarah, he admitted. You've shown me there's more to life than chasing after things that don't last. You've made me want to be better. Sarah's cheeks flushed faintly, but her smile deepened. You've done the hard part yourself. But I'm glad I could help. Oscar stepped closer, his heart pounding. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I don't want to face it without you. Sarah's eyes softened, and after a moment, she reached for his hand. Then let's see where it takes us, together. In the weeks that followed, Oscar embraced his new life with a sense of purpose he had never known. Working side by side with Sarah at the restaurant, he found joy in the small, meaningful moments that had once seemed insignificant. The future wasn't mapped out, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid. He had left behind the man he used to be and was discovering someone far better. And with Sarah by his side, he knew he had all the wealth he would ever need. Sarah watched Oscar intently as he spoke, her expression softening with every word. There was a sincerity in him she couldn't ignore, a depth that resonated with her own struggles. She understood how hard it was to walk away from a life of wealth and privilege. Hearing Oscar lay his heart bare made her admire him even more. And what matters to you now? She asked with a gentle smile. Oscar took a step closer, his heart racing. The answer felt so simple, yet its weight was immense. He met her gaze and said, What matters to me now is being honest about who I am and how I feel. He paused, gathering the courage to continue. Sarah, you're one of the reasons I'm rediscovering who I am. With you by my side, I feel like I can be the best version of myself. Sarah stood in thoughtful silence, his words sinking in. Slowly, a smile appeared on her lips, and she took a small step toward him. Oscar, she began, her voice soft but steady, I've watched you change since the moment you came here. And to be honest, I feel something for you too. Oscar's heart soared. This connection was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. It wasn't about status or wealth. It was something simpler, deeper, and far more real. They stood there for a moment, the world around them fading away, as if nothing else mattered. Without hesitation, Oscar reached for Sarah's hand. She took it, her touch warm and reassuring. They didn't need grand declarations or promises. What they had was enough. It was real. The following week, Oscar made a decision. He would stay in the small town. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid of uncertainty. He had made peace with his past and was learning to value the present. With Sarah by his side, he had found a life that, while simple, was rich in meaning. One evening, as they walked through a field bathed in golden light, Sarah turned to him. Do you think you would have made this choice if you hadn't lost everything? She asked. Oscar paused, considering her question. Probably not, he admitted. If I hadn't lost it all, I wouldn't have met you, and I wouldn't have learned the lessons that matter most. Sometimes, you have to lose everything to realize what truly matters. Sarah smiled, a quiet understanding in her eyes. Together, they continued walking, the future stretched before them like an open road, uncertain but full of promise. Months passed, and Oscar's life took shape in ways he never imagined. He rebuilt, not as the millionaire he once was, but as a man of purpose. With the help of John and other friends he'd made in the town, he invested in small businesses, humble ventures that brought stability and satisfaction. Every decision reflected his newfound values of honesty, simplicity, and meaning. Sarah remained his constant. Her grounded nature and unwavering support reminded him daily of how far he had come. Together, they crafted a life far removed from the excesses of his past, yet richer in ways he hadn't thought possible. But the past wasn't ready to let him go so easily. One sunny Saturday morning, as Oscar prepared for another day at the restaurant, a knock at his door startled him. Opening it, he froze in surprise. Standing there was Elsie, his former fiancée. She looked the same, yet different. Her anxious eyes and hesitance were new to him. Gone was the confident woman who had walked away without a second glance. In her place stood someone whose regret and desperation were palpable. Elsie, Oscar said, his tone measured. What are you doing here? She hesitated, lowering her gaze before meeting his eyes. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "I'm sorry, Oscar," she began. "I made a mistake, a terrible mistake. When you lost everything, I panicked. I thought that without the money, the life we planned was over. I didn't see that. I didn't see you." Oscar's emotions churned. Her words dredged up old wounds, wounds that had taken him so long to heal. "Why now, Elsie?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "What are you hoping to find here?" "I've realized what I lost," she said, stepping closer. "It wasn't the money or the life we dreamed of, it was you, Oscar. I want to make things right." He studied her carefully, searching her face for the truth. Once, he might have yearned for these words, but now, they felt hollow. His heart had moved on, not just from her but from the man he had been. "Elsie," he said softly, "I don't blame you for leaving. I wasn't the person you needed me to be back then. But I've changed and my life has changed too. I've found something here, someone, that matters to me more than anything I had before." Elsie's face fell, and for a moment, she seemed lost. "I see," she murmured. I needed you to know. I'm sorry, Oscar." He nodded, his gaze kind but resolute. "I wish you the best, Elsie. Truly." As she turned to leave, Oscar felt no bitterness, only gratitude, for the lessons her departure had taught him and for the life he had found in its wake. Closing the door, he turned to see Sarah standing nearby, her expression questioning but calm. "Everything okay?" she asked. Oscar walked over, taking her hand. "Better than okay," he said with a smile. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." And as they stood together in the quiet of their shared life, Oscar knew it to be true. What he had now was far more valuable than anything he had lost, and he wouldn't trade it for the world. Time had softened the sting of Oscar's past, but the bitterness of Elsie's betrayal still lingered. He couldn't ignore the way she had chosen financial security over their love, walking away from him at the altar without a second thought. He had been left standing there, rejected, with no chance to explain himself. "You left me at the altar, Elsie," Oscar said, his voice calm but heavy with the weight of that moment. "You didn't even give me a chance to speak. You just walked away." Elsie's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head, regret flooding her face. "I know I was selfish," she said, her voice cracking. "I was immature. I thought money was everything, and when it all disappeared, I panicked. But now I realize that what really mattered was you, and I lost you." She took a shaky breath, trying to regain control of her emotions. "I want to fix things, Oscar. I want to come back to you." Her plea hung in the air, thick with unspoken tension. Oscar looked at her, a mix of nostalgia and compassion stirring within him. Elsie wasn't the same woman he once knew. Time had changed her, just as it had changed him. Maybe it had forced her to see the emptiness of the choices she had made. But still, the truth remained, Oscar had moved on. "Elsie," he said softly but firmly, "what do you think would have happened if I had gotten my fortune back that day? If I were still the man you knew, with all the money and the status, would you be here now, or would you be with me only because of that?" She was silent, the weight of his question settling over her. Oscar knew the answer was clear, but he didn't want to hurt her more than necessary. "You're here now because I've rebuilt my life. But this time without the luxury, without the excess. Now, I'm building something real, something that doesn't depend on how much money I have in the bank." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I'm not that man anymore, Elsie. And honestly, I don't think you understand what that means." Elsie opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. She stared at him, finally realizing the truth. Oscar was a different person, someone she may have never truly known. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears flowing freely down her face. Oscar stepped forward, but instead of pushing her away with anger, he looked at her with compassion. "Elsie," he said gently, "I hope one day you can find what really matters. It's not money or security. You need to look within yourself to find what truly makes you happy." She nodded slowly, her tears a silent acknowledgement. For the first time, it seemed like she understood. But Oscar knew, as she turned and walked away, that it was already too late. The past had been left behind. A year passed, and Oscar's life had transformed completely. He stood at the altar once more, but this time beside someone who embodied everything he had come to value. Sarah stood by his side in a simple, elegant white dress, her smile radiant. Around them, close friends and family gathered for a small, intimate ceremony. There were no extravagant displays, no lavish decor, just love, authenticity, and joy. As Sarah spoke her vows, Oscar felt a deep sense of peace. He had found what he had been searching for, not in wealth or success, but in the pure, honest love of a woman who accepted him for who he truly was. Not the man society had once admired, but the man who, with his flaws and history, had become someone better. After the ceremony, Oscar and Sarah were surrounded by warm embraces from their loved ones, including Harry, who smiled knowingly, as if he had always believed this moment would come. And beside Sarah, Oscar saw his future unfold before him. Their children, twin babies, rested peacefully in a stroller by the altar, the living proof of the love they had built together. Oscar looked at his children, then at Sarah, feeling more complete than he ever thought possible. This was the true wealth of life: love, family, and inner peace. Nothing, absolutely nothing, could compare to this. As the sun set on the horizon, Oscar knew that despite all he had lost, he had gained something far greater. The past no longer defined his future. Everything he needed was right beside him, in Sarah, and in the children who now gave meaning to it all. He had finally found what truly mattered. What do you think? Should Oscar have forgiven Elsie? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. Thank you for watching.